Welcome, everyone. It's 6 o'clock. We'll just give a couple more minutes here and then we'll begin the program. Okay, it's 6:01. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our second informational meeting of 2023. Tonight's topic is disinfection byproducts, particularly haliacidic acids, commonly known as HAA5s. Our consultant, Dr. Rich Gulick, who's been with the company for over 4 years, is here. He has a Master's of Science Public Health, and a PH in water treatment. As I said, he's been here for 4 years, and he's been very instrumental in helping us through many of these projects. He will discuss the science behind the HA formulation and our approach to eliminate them. Dr. Ruby Chang from the Great Barrington Board of Health hopes to be here for the latter part of the meeting, and we're looking forward to her joining as well. I'd like to start by providing some background. Let me share my screen here. By the way, we'll have questions and answers at the end. So some background about Housatonic Water. We serve approximately 1,400 people via 824 service connections, and we supply 100,000 gallons a day. We supply water to Housatonic, West Stockbridge, and a little bit of Stockbridge. Our treatment primarily consists of slow sand filtration, which was built in 1939, and we use chlorine disinfection as well. We use as few chemicals as possible. At this point, we're only using chlorine to disinfect the water. Once the water goes through the slow sand filter and chlorine is added, it goes to a large chamber where chlorine is mixed. It's called a clear well. And over a period of time, the chlorine mixes with the water, disinfects, and it essentially has the safe water that we have going into the system. We also have about 20 miles of pipe, ranging from 2 inches to 14 inches that we maintain. Various materials from ductile iron to transite. A little bit about our source. Long Pond is a high quality water source. It's 563 acres. It has a surface area of 115 acres, which coincidentally is about the same size as the Vatican, and a volume of 300 million gallons of water, and can produce 600,000 gallons of water a day. It's interesting because the pond is fed from snow melt, surface runoff, springs, and unlike other water supplies, it's not fed by brooks or rivers. So it's a more secure source. Water quality testing, that's something that we're all concerned about. And we continually test the water. We have a schedule that's put out by Mass DEP of all the different items that we're testing continuously. We also put out a CCR, a Consumer Confidence Report, every year. And I know that we send it out to every customer, and it's available on our website. And that contains all the information about our water quality. Rich, I'll let you take it from here. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mercer. It's an opportunity very much. I look at these data regularly. I've been following these data for 4.5 years now. I pour into it regularly and be glad to answer any questions about any of the water quality data. But we'll start with the next slide. There's several different water quality monitoring programs. As Jim mentioned, one is since 2018, there's been a bi-weekly monitoring program in the distribution system looking primarily at iron and manganese and color. But the state has a variety of monitoring requirements, monthlies, dailies, annuals, depending on the parameters and so on. And also the treatment plant has several continuous monitors for turbidity and chlorine. They work nonstop and the data to the computer system. Right now, typically the water quality is quite good. The Long Pond is an excellent source water. I believe Housatonic is very lucky to have that as their source water. I've been out on the reservoir. It is spotless water. It is really clear, really clean looking. It's really a good supply. And right now, the treated water meets all of the state and federal regulatory requirements, including for this list of parameters. There have been I'll run through most of these here just briefly, but there have been no detections of bacteria in the finished water that we've seen. The trihalomethanes, one of the organic byproducts of the disinfection process, have always met the regulations. Haloacetic acids currently meet the regulations, and that's the subject we're going to talk about and what happened and why they didn't meet the regulation a year or two. Most lead samples are usually non-detect. There have been no problems meeting the lead and copper action levels for years. No synthetic organic chemicals detected in the drinking water, none of the volatile organic chemicals, none of the heavy metals. These are all non-detected. Even iron, believe it or not, is typically not detected in any of the distribution system samples. 92% of over 400 samples we have of water in the distribution system are non-detect for iron. And that's a very low level detection of 0.05 parts per million. The manganese is the one that causes the periodic color problems. It's not no health issue whatsoever at the levels we see, but it does cause the occasional color problems. We'll touch briefly on that later in the presentation. The next one on the list, the per and poly, going back a slide, Jim. Sorry. It's okay. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, the PFAS, that's one you may have read about in the newspaper or it's seen on the news. It's a nickname I don't like, called forever chemicals. I only think of metals as forever, but they don't break down quickly. And they're a concern for a lot of water utilities and regulators. Those are not detected in the drinking water at Housatonic. Neither are radiological substances nor nitrite. Nitrate is very, very low. At least 100, almost 100 times below the maximum contaminant level. Pesticides, not detected. Algae, barely any. It's a very oligotrophic, very clean reservoir. No taste and odor problem. So I think in all of these cases, the water is pretty much fantastic. There have been the two major exceptions, as noted at the bottom, historical issues with haloacetic acids.
Recording in progress.
We're going to discuss, as well as the color issues with manganese. But we have solutions for both, and we're going to talk about both. Okay, Jim. So the haloacetic acids, where we've had the regulatory issues, they're a byproduct of the disinfection process. As you can see from the circles in the bottom half of the slide, you add the chlorine disinfectant, it reacts with natural organic matter in the water. Space, think of it as decaying leaves, decaying trees, or other organic, biomatter. And it creates these chlorinated disinfection byproducts. The two classes that are regulated now are called trihalomethanes and haloacetic acids. And it's the haloacetic acids that we're focusing on here, because that's the only one where we've had, Housatonix had issues with the regulatory compliance. It's an unfortunate byproduct from the absolutely necessary disinfection process. Jim? So two major steps of what Housatonic does to control these. One is to control the natural organic matter, and the other is to control the chlorine disinfectant. The best ways to, the most direct ways to address the chemical reaction that's occurring. The slow rate sand filters that are used at Housatonic, which is an old technique, very old technique, but highly effective. The ones at Housatonic are extremely superior compared to many others out there in terms of the removal of the total organic carbon. During the summertime, you can see in the plot in the upper right, the three bottom samples at the bottom, the lower ones there, those are all from like January, December, February samples when it's quite cold. It's still removing almost a third of the total organic carbon. But during the spring, summer, and fall, those upper samples, they're around 50% or even higher removal of the TOC. Typically, you would expect 15 to 20% removal of total organic carbon going through a slow sand filter. I have another client in Western Massachusetts. They get about 0% removal of the TOC through their slow sand filters. Otherwise, the water is quite similar to Housatonic's. I attribute that great removal of this natural organic matter, as measured by total organic carbon, to the somewhat novel hydraulic raking system that Housatonic uses to clean the slow sand filters. That it's scraping off part of the top layer, half-inch or so, like it's usually done with slow sand filters. It kind of gives it a washing, and the dirt that has clogged the filter washes away, and it leaves the sand in place. And it's not the sand that removes the contaminants with the slow sand filter. It's actually a population of biogrowth of bacteria and various other bioorganisms that are removing the organic material and cleaning the water and consuming the bacteria and eating that up too. That's what makes that work. Another thing that Housatonic has done, you can see over on the plot in the lower right, those are chlorine levels of the water during the what's called the peak hour flow of each day, which is what you use to calculate disinfection. And you can see there's been a general trend of the chlorine decreasing. This is the chlorine level entering the distribution system from about 1.5 parts per million down to a little bit over 1 part per million. So less natural organic matter, less chlorine disinfectant, there'll be fewer disinfectant byproducts. And that's the strategy we're taking. But we're going to take the second one. We're going to kick that up a notch, the chlorine disinfectant and controlling that, as we're going to talk about a few minutes later, with the new 2-stage chlorination process that Housatonic has implemented. Next slide, Jim. So the question naturally arises, are the benefits of chlorine, do they outweigh the health risks from the disinfection byproducts? Some of those public notices sound quite scary that come from DEP and they're required by EPA. But the direct answer is yes. Chlorine is absolutely essential. It's one of the most important public health advances in human history, filtration through sand and chlorine, just like are used in Housatonic. World Health Organization declared that as the most significant advancement in public health protection in the last millennia. I think it's in history. Using this kind of filtration saved so many people from being sick with E. coli or typhoid fever or cholera and so on, these horrible diseases that used to just plague the United States and still kills about 5 million people a year, I believe it is, throughout the world, these diseases. They don't happen much here in the U.S., largely due to use of chlorination. And we'll discuss in a minute or two. You can go ahead, Jim. Next slide. Actually, it's right here. Okay. So how dangerous are these haloacetic acids? We rely on the public health officials who give these declarations. So what we're doing here is quoting Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection fact sheet on what happens with exposure to these haloacetic acids. And the number 5 in haloacetic acids refers to that there's 9 possible haloacetic acids, and there's 5 that are regulated, and it refers to the sum of those 5. So they considered that they're possibly, it's not definitely, but possibly carcinogenic based on evidence in laboratory animals and limited evidence in people. They mentioned at really high levels of the HA5 and other disinfection byproducts, there's some effects reported in experimental animals. But those effects are really still uncertain because some reports have similar effects, others don't. The folks are still working to address the differences. So it's a somewhat precautionary approach. Keep in mind, go ahead, Jim, that these are chemicals that take years of exposure, decades actually, more so of exposure, as mentioned in the second one here. Here's a quote from the State of Washington Department of Health. They consider, and following some with EPA, I believe, at present, there's no conclusive evidence linking the disinfection byproducts in water, the chlorinated ones, with cancer or other health effects. The city of Springfield, not too far from Great Barrington, actually the city where the Western region of Mass DEP, who regulates Housatonic water, are located. And when they had a recent HAA5 violation, they say the same thing, I believe, in their different public notices, which have been going on for several years now, that the customers may continue to use and consume the water as normal. And I would agree with that assessment. The health risks are associated, they said, with many years and decades. It's actually about 70 years. Consuming two liters a day is where the maximum contaminant levels develop from. So in terms of our HA5 testing, usually and for years, ever since the stage 2 of the disinfection byproduct tool started in 2014 for the sampling for this system, they've been in compliance until the third quarter of 2021. You can see that single spike sticking up in the plot there, which had 100 parts per billion. Housatonic samples each quarter. So they do it in February, May, August, and November. And the compliance is based on a running annual average. So it would be, when that August sample was taken, it would have been averaged with the February and May and November samples before that to come up with what they call the locational running annual average. And those are how Housatonic exceeded with averages in the 60s, about 62, 66 part per billion on the running annual averages compared to the 60 part per billion maximum contaminant level. And why that happened then was due to this one particular sample, for the most part, in August of 2021. In July of 2021, shortly before that sampling, apparently there'd been historical record rainfall in the Great Barrington area, and it changed something in the water. We don't believe it increased the concentration of total organic carbon and natural organic material. That's the precursor to the disinfection byproducts, but it changed something in the nature of it that has since changed back more to its normal state. So of these 10 years of data, 9 of them averaged only 22 parts per billion, while that one from August was at about 100. So that result was then used for that quarter and the next 3 quarters in the averaging, and that's why that particular site failed the MCL for 4 particular quarters. It was mostly from that sample, and the water took a while to return more to normal. In November, the results were still more elevated, so that also contributed some. But it was from that singular change in the water quality that those violations, that they occurred. It was quite an anomaly as to why it happened. And as we can see, the August results are roughly back to where they were, maybe a little bit higher. Thanks, Jim. So in response to the Department of Environmental Protection's requirement to do something other than wait for the water to return to normal, Housatonic has installed a second chlorine feed. We're going to use that to boost the chlorine level that comes after the storage tank that's at the treatment plant, at the end of the treatment plant. And what this will do, it'll allow us to reduce the chlorine that's injected into the water, fed into the water after those slow sand filters, and really reduce the what's called CT, is the concentration of the chlorine times the contact time, and you need a certain amount of CT per the regulations for a given pH and given temperature. We'll be able to reduce the CT as the chlorine goes through the treatment plant by about 2/3, which is a huge decrease. So that will substantially reduce the exposure of that natural organic matter, that total organic carbon, to the chlorine during the long contact times that Housatonic has in the treatment system. Some treatment plants might have half an hour or an hour of chlorine contact time. The contact base in the Housatonic averages about a day of contact time. Storage tank averages about 9 days. And then there's a little over 2 days of contact time in the total distribution system. Also, in terms of manganese removal, Housatonic is very excited. It's a really good pilot study results, and waiting on Mass DEP approval, but plan to install some green sand filters. You use chlorine with green sand filters, and it removes the manganese from the water that has been causing that problematic color. And those green sand filters are going to consume some of the chlorine first applied. So we'll be able to get a pretty strong dose in the clear well, in the contact basin, and then have a lot of that removed, about a part per million, by the green sand, and then have a much lower concentration going through the storage tank, which has that 9 days of contact time. So we think we'll be able to reduce the chlorine concentration in leaving the storage tank by about a part per million. It'll come out pretty low out of the storage tank, and then Housatonic will boost with that new chlorine feed, boost the chlorine up, and have enough to maintain it at the minimum required and minimum needed levels in the distribution system. And you can go to the diagram. So I'm going to run through those concepts again briefly, looking at the treatment plant schematic. The parts in blue are the existing plant. The water comes from Long Pond. It goes through those two slope sand filters. Housatonic measures the turbidity continuously of each of the filters. They each have their own individual online turbidity meter. They then add the chlorine. It's the only feed until October, but now it's chlorine feed number 1. That's sodium hypochlorite, a liquid chlorine solution, basically a strong bleach. Then there's the chlorine contact tank that's got about a 1-day contact time due to its size and the normal average flow rate. Coming out of that, that's the first of 2 disinfection segments for the disinfection needed in the treatment plant, what we think of as primary disinfection. And the Housatonic measures the chlorine, pH, temperature, and flow there, and those data are used to calculate the disinfection performance for segment 1. Let's skip the red squares for a moment. We'll come back to those because those aren't there yet. That's coming up in the future. So the water is pumped from the chlorine contact tank uphill, still on the site, but uphill to the 1.1 million gallon storage tank. It's a tank used to increase the pressure of the water and have some, good storage for water. And coming out of that, Housatonic measures the chlorine, pH, temperature, and flow, and use that to determine segment 2 disinfection. They get disinfection credit, primary disinfection from both segment 1, the contact tank, and segment 2, the storage tank. So then what has been added recently is this chlorine feed number 2 in the green square on the right side of the screen. That's the second chlorine feed, and a little bit downstream from that in the pipe, the samples are taken continuously to measure chlorine, pH, and temperature. So that's maintaining the minimum needed going into the distribution system. That's the chlorine boost. It allows Housatonic to really reduce the chlorine feed in number 1. It will also allow Housatonic to better control the levels of chlorine in the distribution system. Picture how difficult it is to measure, because when it's fed at the beginning of the plant there after the slow sand filters, he's basing those doses on what is monitored in the town, actually in the distribution system, because that's the limiting factor. So you have to have a certain amount there. So it's overdosing, so to speak, much more than needed in the treatment plant to maintain that. But picture 10 days of time for that water. It's a 10-day delay from when that chlorine feed changes until it gets into the pipes to town. That's a very tough to manage, because of that much delay in response to changing the chlorine. Now with this new chlorine feed, the second chlorine, that booster feed, Mr. Mercer and the company will be able to control that chlorine right there, and you'll see the change in 5 minutes, perhaps, and give much better control of the chlorine leaving the storage tank into the town. And that chlorine booster started in October, and things are getting fine-tuned with it and slowly making the adjustments to increase the booster feed and decrease feed number 1. Then, very excitingly also, and there's one other thing about doing this change is it's much less expensive than adding in some other capital project. It's involved adding a sample tap and a new monitor and a chlorine feed pump and so on. It's much less expensive than adding in other treatment units to reduce the natural organic matter or otherwise remove or reduce the disinfectant byproducts. But coming up next year will be the new green sand filters. They're actually called Green Sand Plus, and it's a special material that has a coating on it that can remove the dissolved manganese that once it reacts with chlorine causes the color problems in the water that some of the folks get. And so Housatonic's very excited, waiting on DEP's approval to install those green sand filters. And again, they'll make a nice complement to the strategy of reducing the chlorine going into the storage tank. So it's really a very fine solution to further improve and reduce the haloacetic acid levels. And that's what I had to say about this. Thank you, Jim.
No, thank you, Rich. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. I think that we're seeing in the presentation here how complicated this is. It really is. It's science based. And why? One of the questions we receive all the time is, why is it taking so long to get to this point? Well, largely because, first of all, as we saw back in this earlier slide, that it was a one-time phenomenon in 2021. It started the spike in haloacetic acids in 2021, and then we were looking at different alternatives of how to deal with this. So basically, we increased the number of tests that are being done throughout the system to gather data. And then once we had the data, we reached out to our engineer. Rich was one. And then we have other engineers as well to determine a program to take the existing treatment system that we have and make a modification so that we can eliminate this issue. And basically, it's taken this long to get to that point, between gathering all the data, analyzing all the data, submitting all the required data to the DEP, and having them analyze it all. So if we look back at the hold on, I'm going to go back to the share screen here. So this very complicated chlorine treatment modification, what we're looking to do essentially is, we used to add chlorine at the contact basin. It would go up to the 1,000,000-gallon tank, and then it would go to town. So you had this water sitting between the clear well and the 1,000,000-gallon tank for 10 days. Consequently, these haloacetic acids, the disinfection byproduct issue arose. So now, after all the science, we're at the point where DEP has approved the plan to decrease the amount of chlorine going into the first stage here at the chlorine tank, the blue square here, being stored. Lower levels are being stored at the 1,000,000-gallon tank, and then down here we're adding it just before it goes to town. We're always required to have a residual within town, and this is another way to do it. Instead of having a higher level sitting around in the water for a long period of time, we're just going to be adding it going to town. So this whole science here, and again, it's been done in other facilities, works very well, because you have the disinfection, but you don't have the disinfection byproducts, which are the haloacetic acids. So we started this. We got the approval during the summer. We did the construction of it. We had to run a line, 100-foot line from the pump house out to the main transmission line, and run it back to the pump house and add some monitoring equipment. And DEP came out and inspected it, and we put it online just a month ago. So we're at the point now where we're just, again, it's getting fine-tuned, but we anticipate going forward that this is going to be the solution. And the nice thing about it is it's compatible with the type of system that we have. It's a wonderful source, as we've heard. It's well protected. The methodology we have for dealing with the organics and the disinfection they're green. They're very green. We're not adding a lot of chemicals. We're not using a lot of carbon, energy to do this. It's very natural. The water comes in from the reservoir, goes slowly through the sand filtration. The smaller dose of chlorine is now added as it goes into the clear well, and then it's pumped up to the 1,000,000-gallon tank, and then it goes back into town via gravity. This tank, just as a little bit of background, 30 years ago, there were pressure issues in town, and we had two other small tanks in town, one up on High Street and one up on Prospect Street, that added extra pressure because there was low pressure throughout the system. But once we put this 1,000,000-gallon tank in, we eliminated those two other small additional pumping stations, and it's all gravity fed. So we plan to put in a generator with the new building that we will need for the green sand filters. but it's kind of interesting that 100 years ago, you had water going naturally from the reservoir to the core of town, and everything was fine until the town started to grow and built up on the hills, and then they had problems with pressure. And then the next solution was in 1997 to add this million-gallon tank, an elevated tank, that actually solved the problem as far as pressure goes and created an extra storage, 10 days worth of storage in case something were to happen. So that's pretty much our system there. I'm going to go back, and I think I saw that Dr. Chang is back on. Ruby?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We just went through the basics here of the modifications that we're looking to do to reduce the haliacidic acids. And we're just really focusing on how this is really a science-based. There's a frustration level, I think, from people that thought things could happen very quickly, but it's taken time to get the science down and get the approvals. And now that we're, as we've talked, the modification has been done. We put the 100-foot line in from the pumping station out into the main transmission line so that we can monitor the chlorine levels going to town. And DEP has given us the approval to start the project, which we did about a month ago. And overall, we're planning to reduce the chlorine levels and reduce the haliacidic acids in the future. So I know that the Board of Health, I'm pleased that you're here because I think we want to work together to really try to clear up a lot of the misinformation that's out there. And I thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you for the presentation. As a Board of Health, I would like to address a couple of questions that may affect the health of the people who utilize the water from Long Pond. And that has to do with why we put chlorine into our water. And as you well know, we put chlorine in it to sanitize it. And what are we sanitizing from? It's bacteria. And the bacteria that can cause severe diarrhea and dehydration, that type of thing. That's what we called an emergency that can occur during, when we're utilizing our drinking water. By changing the process of decreasing, as you well know, that we really haven't had any emergency situation from Housatonic Waterworks. And I can't remember the last time you had a problem where you had to issue boiling water. Can you address that a little bit?
Actually, we've never had a boil order, never. We haven't had any positive tests for E. coli. I know other local systems have had E. coli hits. We have not had that. I think a lot of that is because, again, everything that's been done during the last 30 years has been thoughtfully done. The environmental regulations have certainly increased in that review. Well, time consuming, I think serves a purpose because you're saying that there's an overall better service and better quality water throughout the entire country. The Safe Water Treatment Rule, which came in the late 80s, really unified the country as far as water quality goes. Sometimes there are certain parts of the country where there were boil water issues, manganese issues, whatever kinds of issues, and there really wasn't any overriding rules and regulations that everyone followed to meet those standards. But we've we haven't had any issues with E. coli or any bacterial things. It's really just been the two things: the haliacidic acid and the manganese, which are both kind of anomalies for us. But we're working on the science to get that down and get it under control here.
Right. And looking at the Mass DEP, they do have a significant amount of information on haloacetic acid, including how it affects people and how it affects women and children, especially infants. And so my question is that this information is readily available, and they actually give support as to what kind of filters that they could installed into their homes. So all of this information is available to anyone who, if you want to go on the Mass DEP website and look under haloacetic acid, you will find all the correct information that's necessary. And I just wanted to address another issue that is becoming a huge issue in Massachusetts, especially in certain areas near businesses and also people that share groundwater, is PFAS. Now, I understand that you have not detected PFAS in the water in Long Pond. Is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, Rich, you might want to address that. You certainly reviewed all the research on that. We've tested in 22 and 23. Is it, Rich?
21 to 22, there were samples for 4 quarters, and the PFAS 6 was not detected. That the 6 PFAS compounds were listed as not detected by the lab in all 4 lab reports. And you would not expect that in that particular watershed. It's not, there's no likely source of the PFAS. It's usually coming from firefighting, practice places. There's one in Devons that's from near there with a military base. Operations like that. I don't believe there's anything like that within the small watershed of this reservoir. You would expect those compounds to be basically non-detected, though you can get some in rainwater. And there have been reports of that throughout the world, frankly, in rainwater. In most any country, you'll find teeny traces. The analytical chemistry is so good, they're looking at parts per quadrillion at some of the health effects levels. I've never used those levels in my life. I started at parts per million, then went through parts per billion, and then parts per trillion as my career progressed. You're getting lower and lower.
Right.
So, as you all know, PFAS is it never goes away. It does affect your hormones. It does affect your immune system, your thyroid, your kidney. We know that is a chemical that can affect humans, and there have been multiple reports of PFAS in many parts of Massachusetts. For example, Cambridge had to close their public water source because of PFAS. Can you comment on how that is affecting drinking water and the source of drinking water?
At Housatonic? What do you mean, Doctor?
More general.
What I mean is that, now that we're discovering more PFAS in other parts of the state, we have to become more cautious of the fact that it can occur. Now, you're saying that the chance of Long Pond having PFAS is extremely rare. And so what you're saying is that we have an extremely protected source, a water source for our community. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Thank you for putting the words in my mouth, Dr. J. That's absolutely correct. This is a very pristine watershed. It's not perfect. There's some beaver huts out on the water. And if you remove them, they would just get right back there. But that's what the treatment plan is for, is to protect from anything coming from the beavers. This is a very pure water supply, especially in terms of the man-made chemicals. There just aren't any industrial sources there. There's no rivers going into the pond. There's no real even streams going into the pond. Just small inflows. So it's a great pure natural water source that doesn't require extensive treatment. It does require the filters and the chlorine to remove the protozoans and then the larger organisms that cause disease like Cryptosporidium and Giardia, as well as the viruses and the bacteria that the chlorine is so efficient at killing and helping save them. We start with a very pure source, give it great treatment, do lots of monitoring to confirm regular that the water is in really, really good shape. Unfortunately, the manganese that causes that color gives the water a very poor reputation compared to the actual healthiness of this particular water supply. Mm-hmm. And then that short-term exceedance of the haloacetic acids, short-term over the many years that we've been monitoring for that also was, quite unfortunate. in several levels.
I see. So hopefully with this new method, we're not going to be able to endure those kind of contaminants in the near future.
I believe we would not. I don't think we would necessarily see them again anyways, since the water's returning more to its more normal state since that big storm month in July of 2021. But this will help ensure it. We're able to reduce that concentration times time factor by about 2/3 through the treatment plant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doc.
Yeah, I don't have any other questions.
Well, thank you. We have a few questions from, we'll open it up to questions now. A few people already sent them in, and if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. One of the first questions we have is, what level is considered high for HA5s?
Is that for HA5s or for chlorine? I see the question, and it says, what level is considered high? So I'll answer both. For haloacetic acid, it's based on a running annual average. So on that average basis, 60 parts per billion is where the regulation is. So if there's 60 parts per billion over the year on average, you meet the regulation and the standard, what's called the maximum contaminant level. If you have a 61, you don't. So ours were exceedances. They were in the 60s, so they were too high, but not very, very high. I've seen some, that are in the hundreds. That's a whole different story.
Right.
In terms of normal levels, for example, those normally in August were in the average 22. They went from about 12 to, or 14 maybe, up to 35 parts per billion, compared to that, annual average limit of 60. So usually those August haloacetic acids were pretty low, as they were throughout the year, typically until that 2021 started. In terms of the chlorine, the doses aren't very high at Housatonic. It's only the dose is about 3.3 parts per million. And then it goes into the town a little over 1 part per million. So there's only about 2 parts per million consumed. But we're going to be able to, again, we're not changing the time. That contact time doesn't change at all in this new procedure. What changes is the chlorine concentration that the water sees over that time. Most of the haloacetic acids and triomethanes form within the first 2, maybe 3 days of the water. So even if we cut 10 days down to 5, it wouldn't make much difference. But by dropping the chlorine, say from 3.3 down to 2 parts per million going into the plant, that reduces the driving force, the chemical driving force that creates the formation of those byproducts, and will greatly reduce them. So we've both got Mother Nature on our side in terms of the water being back to more normal versus that anomalous result in 2021, that summer, as well as improved chlorination. This procedure could have been done earlier, but there was never any strong push because the disinfection byproducts were always quite low compared to the standards. In terms of the chlorine in the distribution system, we need at least 0.2 parts per million. And that's our minimum goal for that.
And that's a bit of a challenge because we have we have main transmission lines, then we have the core of town, then we have some outlying areas that really have to have that residual. So we have to maintain a little bit higher level in the core of town in order for those outlying areas to test it at the 0.2 level. So that's why there's some variation in the amount of chlorine that people might experience in different parts of town. Very good. The next question, can you see the questions, everyone?
Oh.
Yeah. So the other one is regarding how long the water is in the pipes.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I was just alluding to that question a moment ago when I mentioned that the water age, that we're not changing the water age. It averages just about 1 day in the contact tank, that clear well, about 9 days in the storage tank, and just over 2 days in the distribution system. And that will stay the same. We're not moving that time anywhere. We're not changing the chlorine concentration in the distribution system. That will still be maintained at the same levels with that new booster chlorine pump. What we're doing is changing the chlorine concentration initially put into the water, and especially what the chlorine concentration that is throughout that storage tank that has that 9-day contact period. It's more that driving force again that we're looking to change.
Right. The other part of that question is the water tested regularly throughout the system? And that's one of the things that does happen. It's tested randomly by we have Berkshire, Housatonic Basin does our sampling, and they test throughout the system all the time, all year long for different things. Twice a month for chlorine at different locations, so that is continually sampled, and it's done by an independent tester. I have other questions over.
Can I add to that, Jim?
Certainly.
Just briefly. In addition to the normal regulatory required monitoring from DEP, back in when the color issue came up pretty strongly in August of 2018, since then they've required a biweekly monitoring program. So we've collected somewhere around 470 different samples for iron, manganese, chlorine, turbidity, and so on throughout the distribution system in the source water and at the end of the treatment plant. So we get data we've been getting data every 2 weeks showing us the manganese and color and the lack of iron in the distribution system water for a long time. The quickest notice you'll see is whether the water changes color. That's quicker than we'll actually get the results back. And that color doesn't occur every year. It occurred in 2018, but not in 2019. Then we had 3 years in a row, but didn't really have it this year. So 2 of the last 6 years, the manganese didn't come up high in the Long Pond water, high enough to create color issue. But I've never seen a water system that has such high water quality be monitored so frequently as Housatonic's water.
We have a question from Elizabeth.
Yes, I have 2. On your chlorine treatment chart, you indicated by a green arrow that you added to measure the turbidity this year before the chlorine treatment. Why don't you measure the turbidity in the water going out to the town? This is what we have been complaining about, the dirty water. And also the PFAS, were any of these tests run in July and August?
Okay, I believe that one of the PFAS samples was in July, yes. I think so. I'd have to take a look back. I remember there was an April. In February, so it's probably a July 22, I believe. In terms of the reason where you want to measure the turbidity is immediately after the filters. That's where the turbidity is removed. And so that's the process that you want to monitor with the turbidity. It's regulated there coming out of the filters. It is not regulated leaving the treatment plant. It's regulated after that particular process. The water that turns color isn't high in turbidity. It's high in manganese that has been oxidized by the chlorine, and it is particulate, but it creates a lot of color, but not much actual turbidity. And so that would be another part of the reason for not measuring the turbidity there. The turbidity is measured in grab samples that are taken, and measured with a hand or desktop instrument by the laboratory that are taken at point of entry samples, but not an online continuous monitor like the 2-slope sand filter effluents have. So that's the reason for that, Elizabeth.
But shouldn't it then be measured at the end going out to the town also?
Not necessarily, no. There's no limit for it to compare it to. It is measured, again, by some grab samples, but the continuous sample, since the turbidity is not removed elsewhere in that process. So, and you're measuring the turbidity really is an indicator of removing the bacteria through the filter and the Cryptosporidium and Giardia. That's what we're trying to remove with that. We're not trying to measure how the color changed from the manganese, which is the effect you see. It feels like dirty water, but it's really more colored water than it is dirty water, especially when it's that kind of light yellow color.
It is dirty water if it stains porcelain toilets and tubs and our clothing. It is dirty
manganese
water.
will stain those, absolutely. And you can use the word dirty, and I'll go along with that, but it's not turbid, which means a lot of particles basically suspended in the water, which is what that turbidity would monitor. So the best way to monitor for the problem that you're seeing, Elizabeth, is to monitor the manganese levels, or literally look at the color of the water, which I believe is the quickest way to do it. I use, most of my clients have manganese problems, so I keep white styrofoam cups with me, and I use those to compare the water color to distilled water or some other, clean water source. It's a very quick test of that. But again, the turbidity is removed at the filters, nowhere else in the treatment.
Thank you. Next question is from Deborah.
Hi, I have two questions. One is, why do some people, during the period when people are having manganese problems, some people had very dark chocolate covered water, some people had lighter tea colored water. If the source of the manganese is in Long Pond, why isn't there a consistency?
Because it's not as so much the total manganese level that creates the color, it's the particulate manganese, which occurs once the chlorine has reacted with it. So, and the chlorine reacts with manganese slowly, reacts with iron very quickly in a matter of seconds, but very slowly with chlorine. It may take days to oxidize the manganese. So there may be different degrees of that. And there's also the water quality conditions in most drinking water systems are at levels in terms of pH and other controlling factors that make make it more likely that there's going to be variations in what's seen of the manganese with the color.
I guess I don't completely understand what you're saying, because I would assume maybe it might vary from day to day, but why does it vary from household to household? Even people, I know of people who live next door to each other who have, very different complaints about the color of water. Some don't notice it, and some have to go to the laundromat. I
could not answer that.
That's it.
All of the samples
Sure, go ahead.
coming, I could not answer that if there's a house-to-house difference. I wouldn't think that would be the extent of the chlorine oxidation of the manganese. Remember, you don't see the manganese in Long Pond. You don't see it until it reacts with the chlorine. It's
okay, so I have one. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I have one question about the chlorine. Does the amount of chlorine you add change from day to day? And if you were, I'm not saying that you're required to, but if you were to test for HA5 daily, would the amounts vary from day to day?
They could vary day to day. I wouldn't expect much in this particular system because it's very steady state. It's a very consistent water quality.
Okay.
The chlorine level does change from day to day, the amount. There's adjustments made periodically to make sure there's enough and not too much in the distribution system. The water itself, the oxidant or chlorine demand can change a little bit, but mostly it's typically 2.4, 2.6, 2.5 gallons of chlorine a day. It changes pretty little from day to day as far as how much is added. And same with the doses. They're fairly consistent, actually.
Okay, one final question. If somebody has the brown water, I mean, I know it hasn't been as prevalent this summer, but if it were to come back, or people who had it in the past, what are the health effects of drinking water with that kind of level of manganese?
I would say
do people have to be concerned?
No, ma'am, they do not. I don't have slides handy to show you at the moment. I could if I took a minute. There's a couple things to consider. There are health not standard levels, but health advisory levels in Massachusetts of a 0.3 for a short-term impact. I believe it's on children or infants, and then a longer life-term limit of 1 per million. The levels in Housatonic's water are below those. They've reached the 0.3, but only a couple times. But first, the levels are below those health advisory levels. So that's a good sign. Secondly, you got to read the fine print on that health advisory, because what they're really saying, once I read into it, is they know there's no impact below those levels. They don't know, they're not saying there would be an impact above those levels, but they know there's none below it. So I got curious once I read that, and realizing that manganese is an essential health nutrient. You know, it's in a lot of vitamin pills, and you can buy supplements. The actual recommended daily intake from the U.S. National Institutes of Health are actually startlingly close to the health advisory limits coming from Mass DEP and EPA. And it's a really odd thing. You can go and, you know, we're looking at levels that are 0.05 parts per million. And you can go into the store and buy manganese supplement pills that have 50 milligrams, 50 compared to 0.05.
Yeah, you know, I'm going to say the supplement industry may not be that well regulated, and people probably do take supplements that are, you know, questionable for their health. But I mean, if you had brown water like that, would you use it for infant formula? Would you give it to your 3-year-old?
No, I wouldn't. I would not.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be very concerned. There is a disease called manganism, which is from excessive manganese. And I'm not a scientist or a physician, so I can't say what level of consumption will lead somebody to be at risk for that disease. But I think people have a right to be concerned when their water is discolored. I guess that's my final word.
Deborah, I agree. The discolored water is extremely problematic. I've dealt with this with systems for many years. I really appreciate the Complaints Act. I dedicate a lot of my time to try to fix these problems for people just like you. The manganese that you're seeing there are not a health hazard. It's scary because it looks yellow or brown, and that'll scare the heck out of people. But it's just not scientific. It is just not a health hazard at those levels. Actually, it's more of a, you know, it is an essential nutrient for enzymes in our bodies and various other aspects.
But you said you wouldn't use it for infant formula. I mean, I don't think you're being consistent. I'm saying it would be safe, but that doesn't mean I would use a brown water. It's one. Sure, my wife. An infant doesn't know anything about the color. It's really the parent who has to decide if they're putting their child's health at risk. That's all I'll say. It's perception, in my view. So I wouldn't blame somebody for not wanting to bathe in brown water, whether it's technically safe or not. I mean, I understand that. So should we get a refund for the months we had brown water? If it was unusable for normal purposes? I mean, I'm asking that as it's almost a rhetorical question because I know we're not going to get it, but I raise it as a question. Well, it isn't something that was caused by negligence by the water company. It may not be caused by negligence, but if it's not usable, then why should we pay for it? I'm not alleging negligence. I understand. I don't have the frustration. The only thing I can add is a system was never installed or bought by the community to treat manganese. So the community doesn't own the water company. The Mercer family owns the water company. We are simply the customers. We don't make the decisions about what systems get installed. And they can't on their own either because they have to go through Department of Public Utilities to get approval. And sometimes when they're gone, maybe we have to blame them and ask them for our refund.
I don't think there's any blaming going on. We're just working through a problem here. Do you have any more questions for us?
No, I have nothing further. Thank you.
Oh, thank you,
Deborah.
No, thank you. Next question, Matt O'Brien.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having the meeting. I just wanted to bring this up one more time. I know it's from left field and most of the scientific community hasn't seen this paradigm yet. But if you go to primarywaterinstitute.com, for a fraction of the price that what you're going through to clean this water and to do all this stuff, if you were to drill down to the bedrock, and then they traditionally use dry ice to frack it, there is so much water that is pristine down there everywhere. This is known now. Why it doesn't come out, I don't know why that is. But, you also have atmospheric stuff that can go into the lake. God forbid stuff comes, from the sky or whatever. But on a long-term situation, I called the University of Miami is the only university that tests for tritium. Now that's a radioactive carbon that comes from all the atomic bombs that were blown up. And if you find a spring and you have it tested there and it does not have tritium in it, that is not basin water or lake water. That is actually manufactured in the earth, H2O, hydrogen and oxygen, under pressure. You don't even need pumps. I've seen one well so far in my life that was amazing. But, I called the University of Miami. My friend had a well, or a spring rather, and we wanted to get it tested. So I asked them, called directly into the, place, and they didn't know what I'm talking about. They never heard of primary water. So 15 minutes later, I call back and I say, give me the lab. I call down, they send me downstairs to the lab. I get this wonderful woman on the phone. She knows exactly what primary water is. She says, we all get our water from here in Florida where they were, and they all get their water from there. Now that's pristine. I mean, pristine water. The health benefits are beyond. In Hungary, they found a town where all the kids were like super brilliant, and they couldn't figure out what was different about this town, the percentages of these kids. And the only thing they found was their spring was a primary well. And I know this sounds far-fetched, but you can go to, which I mentioned before, it's primarywaterinstitute.org, and you can read about it. It's everywhere. If we had only relied on atmospheric water, this planet, they figure, would probably only have lasted about 3 million years. It's constantly fed. That's why probably the lake where you are, I mean, you can't just be getting rainwater. There's got to be water coming up also from underneath. And if you have to drill, it would be a fraction of what it costs you to do all of this filtering and going through the rigmaroles and all this stuff. And the pressure would also, you'd probably have to cut the pressure down to send it out to us, and not only that, then you could use your lake and start a health center where you sell the water there, Jim,
Right.
instead of using it for Housatonic. And I know it sounds far-fetched, but I want to keep bringing it up because paradigms do happen, and somebody has to eventually look into it for the benefits of everybody, not only Housatonic water, but the people, and the only other thing I want to say on a short term was, has anybody investigated chlorine dioxide instead of using chlorine for the water? Now, this has been used for over 100 years for, purifying water all over the world. And the side effects are actually beneficial to human beings, they've discovered. So, I don't know what the regulations are, but that's a short-term idea. And I just wanted to bring it up again because I think people should start looking at these paradigms that just haven't been picked up yet, that are there under the ground, very simply, without having to go through this huge rigmarole, complicated, expensive processes to get us, pure water. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks. Dr. Chang.
I just wanted to clarify, Deborah brought up a pretty important point about giving manganese to infants less than 12 months of age. There is, I had attended a conference from Boston Children's Hospital, and they had a speaker that basically did say that if the manganese level is greater than 0.3 milligrams per liter, that kids less than 12 months of age should not be drinking the water. So they will have to drink bottled water to make their formula. Hopefully they're drinking breast milk and not formula. But there is data to that effect. I just wanted to clarify. But it doesn't sound like your levels were that high. Is
Dr.
that
Chang,
true?
I mentioned the 0.3 short-term exposure health advisory. That's the exact same one you're mentioning.
Yep.
And the levels at Housatonic are almost always below 0.3 milligram per liter. They're usually, it would be more about, they're seeing the color at 0.03, 0.02, up to maybe 0.1. The highest samples reach 0.3, but only a few samples out of hundreds.
Okay.
They're not at those health advisory levels for any length of time.
Yes.
But again, if the bottled water, the bottles are so, there would be such a small volume of water, I could see somebody, you don't have to use something else, but you could.
Right.
That's the consumer's choice.
Thank you. And any other questions for tonight?
Olivia wants to say hello here.
Oh, your cat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Seeing none, I thank you everyone for attending. At the height of the meeting, we had 26 attendees, including the presenters. This PowerPoint will be on our website. Also on our website is information regarding all the testing that we do, our annual CCR reports, and information regarding discolored water, manganese, haliacidic acids, etc. And if anyone has any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Either by phone or email, we'd be happy to respond. Thank you everyone for attending. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.